The woman who owned the world. Margaret Whitmore stood at the pinnacle of success. The sweeping view from her corner office, perched high above the bustling city, symbolized the empire she had painstakingly built. Her reflection on the pristine glass window mirrored an image of power, an immaculately tailored cream suit, her chestnut hair perfectly coiffed, and a face bearing the polished confidence of someone who always got her way. Whitmore Enterprises wasn't just a company, it was her legacy. Margaret thrived on the structure of her days, where every minute was a calculated step toward further solidifying her dominance in the business world. Today had been no exception. Back-to-back meetings filled with negotiations, deal-closing handshakes, and the unrelenting glow of admiration from her colleagues had left her energized. Margaret relished being a woman who commanded attention and respect in every room she entered. As the afternoon melted into evening, Margaret decided it was time to reward herself. Picking up her phone, she called her closest circle of friends, women she carefully curated not only for their affluence, but also for their unwavering awe of her achievements. "Ladies," Margaret said with her signature mix of charm and authority, "let's celebrate. La Belle Epoque. 1 hour. Don't be late." After ending the call, Margaret leaned back in her chair, sipping her espresso and letting the satisfaction of another victorious day wash over her. She knew she deserved this life. The luxury, the power, and the reverence of everyone around her. It wasn't luck. It was her relentless pursuit of excellence. She had clawed her way from modest beginnings to a life where she could dictate her own terms. Her chauffeur arrived punctually, whisking her through the city's busy streets toward La Belle Epoque, one of the most exclusive fine dining establishments in town. The restaurant was Margaret's second home, a place where she could bask in the glow of being a valued patron. It was not just a dining experience, it was a stage where her success played out. As Margaret stepped out of the car, her heels touched the cobblestone driveway with the precision of a queen's footfall. Charles, the maitre d', greeted her with a slight bow and his ever-reverent tone. "Miss Whitmore, your table is ready. A pleasure to have you this evening." Margaret's lips curved into a smile. "Thank you, Charles. My friends will be joining shortly. Bring the usual champagne." The restaurant's warm glow enveloped Margaret as she walked through the elegant foyer, chandeliers casting soft light on her sharp features. Her usual table was situated perfectly in the center of the room, ensuring she was visible to anyone who mattered. This was her court, and she was its queen. Her friends arrived soon after, their air kisses and effusive compliments making the evening feel like a well-rehearsed ceremony. They gushed over Margaret's latest business triumph, a merger that promised to redefine the industry. Each time Margaret spoke, they hung onto her words, marveling at her ingenuity. For Margaret, this admiration was like a drug, a reminder that she had everything under control. Jenny Caldwell entered the dining room with the practiced grace of someone who knew how to remain unnoticed. Dressed in the restaurant's uniform, her natural poise and bright smile contrasted sharply with the sharp-edged conversations and laughter that echoed around her. She approached Margaret's table with her notepad in hand, her voice soft but confident. "Good evening, ladies. Welcome to La Belle Epoque. Would you like to start with some appetizers, or go straight to the mains?" Margaret's eyes scanned Jenny with the same dispassionate curiosity one might reserve for a piece of furniture. Margaret's tone, laced with condescension, cut through the polished ambience. "My dear, is this what you imagined for yourself? Waiting on tables? How quaint." Jenny blinked but didn't flinch. Her smile didn't waver as she responded, "Ma'am, I'm learning every part of the business. This is just one step in." Margaret waved her hand, dismissing Jenny mid-sentence. "Spare me the fairy tale, darling. Let's not pretend this is anything more than it is." Margaret's friends laughed, their voices echoing Margaret's disdain. Jenny's cheeks flushed, but her professionalism didn't falter. She nodded politely, noted the group's champagne request, and walked away with her head held high. "Honestly," Margaret said, leaning back in her chair with an amused smile, "some people don't understand their place in the world. She should be thanking me for even giving her the chance to serve someone like me." The women at the table chuckled, their laughter cutting through the room. Margaret reveled in the moment, basking in the glow of her friend's approval. To her, the interaction was nothing more than an amusing anecdote, a reminder of her superiority. But unbeknownst to Margaret, Jenny's quiet strength had not gone unnoticed by others in the restaurant. The staff exchanged glances, silently rooting for their colleague. There was something about Jenny's calm dignity that resonated deeply, even in the face of Margaret's cruel barbs. When Jenny returned with the champagne, Margaret saw an opportunity to drive her point home. She scrutinized the way Jenny poured, her sharp eyes searching for any mistake to pounce on. "You might want to steady your hand," Margaret said with a smirk. "Not everyone can afford to waste this kind of champagne." Jenny met Margaret's gaze, her composure unwavering. "I'll be careful, ma'am," she said softly, finishing the pour without spilling a drop. Margaret leaned closer to one of her friends. "See, with the right guidance, even the simplest minds can manage basic tasks." The group erupted in laughter again, and Jenny turned to leave, her cheeks burning. As she retreated to the kitchen, Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling triumphant. This was the life she had built, a life where she could bend others to her will and remind the world of her dominance. But Margaret's self-satisfaction blinded her to the storm that was brewing. She was so accustomed to controlling every situation that she failed to notice the shift in the room's energy. Her harsh words and condescending demeanor were not forgotten. They were remembered, witnessed, and silently judged. As Jenny disappeared into the kitchen, she whispered to herself, "One day they'll see me for who I really am. And when they do, they'll regret underestimating me." The evening, which began as a celebration of Margaret's success, was already becoming something else entirely. What Margaret couldn't see, what she refused to see, was that the pedestal she stood on was built on shaky ground, and it was only a matter of time before it crumbled beneath her. The storm beneath the calm. Jenny leaned against the cool stainless steel counter in the bustling kitchen of La Belle Epoque. The murmurs of orders being shouted, pots clanging, and dishes being plated filled the air. But it was all background noise to her now. Her mind replayed the interaction at Margaret Whitmore's table like a scratchy film reel, each insult searing fresh wounds into her confidence. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You're better than this, Jenny," she told herself. "Don't let her win." Jenny wasn't just any waitress. Her mother, Isabella Caldwell, owned La Belle Epoque, a legacy built through years of hard work and impeccable standards. Jenny had insisted on starting from the ground up, working as a dishwasher, line cook, and now a server. Her mother had taught her that every aspect of the business mattered, and Jenny was determined to earn her place, not inherit it. Marie, a senior waitress who had seen it all, approached her with concern. "Jenny, sweetheart, what's going on out there? You look like you've been through the ringer." Jenny gave a small smile, but her voice was tinged with frustration. "Just one of those customers, you know the type. Thinks the world revolves around them." Marie nodded knowingly. "You mean the Margaret Whitmores of the world." I saw her name on the reservation list and braced myself. That woman's got a tongue sharper than a chef's knife. Jenny chuckled softly, but the laugh didn't reach her eyes. "I can handle it. I have to handle it." Marie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, you don't. Let me take over. Isabella wouldn't want you dealing with someone like that." Jenny straightened, her resolve hardening. "Thanks, Marie, but I need to prove I can handle customers like her. It's part of the job, isn't it?" Marie sighed, seeing the determination in Jenny's eyes. "Just don't let her get under your skin, okay? She's not worth it." Jenny nodded, the fire in her chest burning a little brighter. She adjusted her apron, checked her reflection in the polished kitchen window, and headed back out to the dining room. At Margaret's table, the air was electric with self-satisfied laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Margaret was regaling her friends with tales of her latest corporate triumphs, each story carefully curated to highlight her brilliance. Her friends, ever eager to remain in her good graces, hung on every word. And then, Margaret said, her voice dripping with pride, "I told the board that if they didn't approve the merger, they could kiss their bonuses goodbye." Let's just say, the deal was signed by lunchtime. Her friends erupted into appreciative laughter. One of them, a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, raised her glass. To Margaret, the queen of negotiation. Margaret basked in the toast, lifting her own glass with a smug smile. To knowing your worth, and making sure everyone else knows it too. Jenny approached the table quietly, carrying the appetizers Margaret had ordered. She placed the plates down with steady hands, her professionalism intact despite the barbs that had been thrown her way earlier. "Here are your appetizers. Ladies, is there anything else I can get you right now?" Jenny asked, her voice calm and measured. Margaret glanced at the dishes, then at Jenny, her brow furrowing in exaggerated disapproval. "What is this?" she asked, pointing at the escargot. "I specifically asked for these to be arranged in a spiral. Does this look like a spiral to you?" Jenny blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She leaned closer to inspect the plate. "I apologize if it's not to your liking, ma'am. I can have the kitchen redo it." Margaret sighed theatrically, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, forget it. Just bring the main courses. Hopefully, the chef can get those right." Jenny nodded, keeping her composure. As she turned to leave, Margaret's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Wait a moment," Margaret said, her tone sharp. "Is that a smudge on the side of my glass?" Jenny froze, her jaw tightening imperceptibly. She turned back to inspect the glass Margaret was holding up like a prized artifact. "I don't see a smudge, ma'am, but I can replace the glass for you if you'd like." Margaret let out a derisive laugh, turning to her friends. "See, this is what happens when you hire people without proper training. Standards are a dying concept." Jenny felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'll bring you a new glass right away, ma'am." She walked away, her fists clenched at her sides. She didn't see Margaret's self-satisfied smirk or the way her friends laughed, but she didn't need to. She could feel their mockery like a weight on her shoulders. Back in the kitchen, Jenny set the glass down on the counter with a little more force than necessary. One of the kitchen staff, a young chef named Daniel, looked up from his station. "You okay, Jenny?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Jenny shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm fine. Just dealing with someone who thinks they're better than everyone else." Daniel chuckled knowingly. "Welcome to hospitality. Some people think their money makes them gods." Jenny didn't respond, instead grabbing a fresh glass and carefully polishing it. As she worked, her thoughts churned. Margaret's words had cut deeper than she cared to admit, not because of their cruelty, but because they reminded her of the uphill battle she'd faced her entire life. Jenny had grown up watching her mother fight tooth and nail to build La Belle Epoque from the ground up. Isabella Caldwell wasn't just a restaurateur, she was a force of nature. But even with her success, Isabella had faced her share of prejudice and doubt, especially as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated industry. Jenny had inherited that same resilience, but moments like these tested her resolve. She returned to the table with the new glass, setting it down with the precision of someone who refused to be broken. "Here you are, ma'am," Jenny said, her voice steady. Margaret took the glass without so much as a thank you, turning her attention back to her friends. "Finally," she muttered, loud enough for Jenny to hear. Jenny walked away, her head held high. She couldn't afford to let Margaret's arrogance win, not tonight. Not ever. As the evening wore on, Margaret grew bolder in her disdain, each comment cutting deeper than the last. Jenny endured it all with quiet dignity, but the tension in the room was palpable. Other diners began to notice the dynamic, their murmurs filling the air. At the far end of the restaurant, Isabella Caldwell sat with a group of business associates, her presence commanding without effort. She was deep in conversation, when she noticed the shift in the room's energy. Her eyes flicked toward Margaret's table, narrowing as she observed the interaction between Margaret and Jenny. Isabella excused herself from the table, her instincts telling her something was wrong. She rose with the poise of someone who had weathered countless storms, her gaze fixed on her daughter. As she approached the table, the room seemed to grow quieter, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret, oblivious to the approaching storm, continued to bask in her perceived superiority. But as Isabella drew closer, her expression changed. For the first time that evening, Margaret's confidence faltered. Jenny, catching sight of her mother, felt a wave of relief, but also trepidation. She had wanted to handle this herself, but now that Isabella was here, she knew the evening was about to take a dramatic turn. Isabella stopped at the edge of the table, her presence commanding attention without a word. Margaret looked up, her smile freezing on her lips as recognition dawned. The tables were about to turn, and Margaret Whitmore had no idea just how high the stakes had become. A quiet reckoning. Isabella Caldwell stood at the edge of Margaret Whitmore's table, her elegant posture radiating calm authority. The restaurant's buzz dimmed as the tension around the table began to spread to nearby diners. Isabella's reputation preceded her. Her presence commanded attention, and Margaret, usually the most self-assured person in any room, suddenly felt the heat of an unspoken challenge. Jenny's heart pounded as she caught her mother's eye. She hadn't wanted Isabella to intervene, but she also knew that when her mother spoke, people listened. Isabella's reputation as a formidable yet fair businesswoman wasn't just confined to the culinary world. Her influence extended far beyond the walls of La Belle Epoque. Margaret, still unaware of the connection between Isabella and Jenny, forced a bright smile and extended her hand. "Isabella Caldwell," she said, her tone dripping with feigned warmth. "What a surprise. I didn't realize you were dining here tonight." Isabella ignored the outstretched hand, her sharp gaze flicking to Jenny for a split second before returning to Margaret. "I dine here often," she said evenly, "and tonight I couldn't help but notice some rather spirited exchanges coming from this table." Margaret blinked, her confidence faltering. "Oh, that. Just a misunderstanding. You know how it is with restaurant staff. Sometimes they need a little guidance." "Guidance," Isabella repeated, her voice calm but carrying an edge. "I see." Margaret nodded eagerly, trying to steer the conversation back into her control. Yes. I mean, it's a lovely establishment, of course, but sometimes the service can be, well, let's just say inconsistent." Jenny, standing a few feet away, felt her stomach churn. She wanted to defend herself, to tell her mother everything Margaret had said, but she also didn't want to make a scene. Instead, she watched as Isabella slowly placed a hand on the back of an empty chair and pulled it out, taking the seat at the table uninvited. The move was subtle, but the power dynamic shifted instantly. Isabella leaned back slightly, her eyes steady on Margaret. "I take pride in this restaurant," she said, her tone measured. "Every detail, every employee, every dish, it all reflects the values I've worked hard to build. So when someone finds fault with my staff, I take it very seriously." Margaret's smile tightened, a bead of sweat forming at her temple. "Oh, no offense intended, of course. It's just that some people aren't quite suited for certain roles. You understand, don't you?" Isabella's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I understand more than you think, Margaret, and I understand that respect, for people at every level, isn't just a value. It's a necessity." Margaret swallowed hard, sensing the weight of Isabella's words, but still not fully grasping their significance. "Of course. Respect is key. I agree completely." Isabella's gaze flicked to Jenny, who was standing a few steps back, her posture straight despite the storm raging inside her. "Jenny," Isabella said, her voice softer now. "Come here, please." Jenny stepped forward hesitantly, unsure of where this was going. Her mother rarely intervened publicly unless it was absolutely necessary. Isabella gestured to the space beside her. "Stand here, next to me." Jenny obeyed, her heart racing, as she felt the eyes of the entire restaurant on her. Isabella turned her attention back to Margaret, her expression unreadable. "Margaret," Isabella said slowly, "I'd like to introduce you to Jenny Caldwell, my daughter." The words landed like a thunderclap. Margaret's jaw dropped, her face draining of color as she stared at Jenny, her mind racing to piece together what had just been revealed. The waitress she had humiliated, belittled, and mocked was not just an employee. It was Isabella Caldwell's daughter. I didn't realize," Margaret stammered, her usual poise crumbling. "If I had known, you would have treated her differently." Isabella interrupted, her voice sharp now. "You would have extended the respect she deserves, not because of her position, but because she's my daughter." Margaret fumbled for words, her carefully curated facade shattering. I didn't mean." "What you meant," Isabella said firmly, cutting her off, "was that her uniform made her invisible to you, that you saw her as beneath you. Tell me, Margaret, would you have spoken to me the way you spoke to her?" Margaret's hands trembled slightly at it as she gripped the edge of the table. "Of course not. I have the utmost respect for you, Isabella." Isabella leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Then you should know that the same respect applies to every person who works here, whether they're wearing an apron, carrying a tray, or signing contracts in an office." Margaret's friends, who had been silent up until now, exchanged uncomfortable glances. The weight of Isabella's words hung heavy in the air, leaving no room for rebuttal. Jenny stood silently, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. She hadn't wanted her mother to fight her battles, but she couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Margaret squirm under Isabella's scrutiny. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or belittled by people like Margaret. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice trembling. "I owe you an apology. Both of you. I was out of line." Isabella leaned back, her gaze unyielding. "You owe Jenny an apology, not me." Margaret turned to Jenny, her expression a mix of shame and desperation. "Jenny, I'm deeply sorry for the way I treated you. It was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me." Jenny held Margaret's gaze, searching for sincerity in her words. After a moment, she nodded slightly. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your apology." Margaret exhaled in relief, but the humiliation was far from over. Isabella stood, her movements deliberate and graceful. "Margaret," she said, her voice carrying a finality that sent a chill down Margaret's spine, "I suggest you take a moment to reflect on what happened here tonight. Respect isn't something you reserve for those you deem worthy. It's something you give freely, or not at all." With that, Isabella turned to Jenny and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Come with me, sweetheart," she said softly. Jenny followed her mother as they walked away from the table, leaving Margaret and her friends in stunned silence. The dining room buzzed with whispered conversations as the other patrons tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Margaret sat frozen, her mind racing as she realized the full extent of what she had done. This wasn't just about a moment of arrogance, it was a revelation of her own character. And as she stared at the untouched glass of champagne in front of her, Margaret felt the weight of her actions settle over her like a suffocating blanket. For the first time in her life, Margaret Whitmore was at a loss. The cracks began to show. Margaret Whitmore remained frozen in her seat long after Isabella and Jenny had walked away. The room around her felt like it was closing in, the murmurs of other diners amplifying her discomfort. She could feel their gazes, judging, dissecting, and scrutinizing every inch of her. Her friends, who had always rallied behind her, now avoided eye contact, their laughter and chatter replaced by an awkward silence. Margaret's world, once so perfectly curated and under her control, now felt like it was unraveling. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing. How had this happened? How had a simple dinner turned into an embarrassing public spectacle? Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Jenny leaned against the cool stainless steel of the kitchen counter, her shoulders tense and her mind racing. Her mother stood beside her, arms crossed, but her expression softening. Isabella Caldwell rarely allowed her emotions to dictate her actions, but seeing Margaret humiliate her daughter had tested every ounce of her restraint. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Isabella asked, her voice calm but laced with concern. Jenny nodded, though her eyes betrayed the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "I'm fine, Mom. I didn't want it to get to this point. I could have handled it." Isabella smiled gently, placing a hand on Jenny's shoulder. "I know you could have, but there's a difference between handling something and letting someone walk all over you." Margaret needed to be reminded of that. Jenny sighed, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "It's not just about me, though. She thinks she can treat anyone like that. I see it all the time. People who think their money or status makes them better than everyone else." Isabella's eyes hardened, her resolve clear. "That's exactly why I intervened. People like Margaret thrive on their ability to intimidate and belittle. If no one stands up to them, they'll never change." Jenny nodded, but the lingering humiliation still burned in her chest. She wasn't sure if Margaret had truly learned anything from the confrontation, or if she was simply trying to save face. "Take the rest of the night off," Isabella said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Mary can handle your tables. You've done enough for tonight." Jenny hesitated, torn between wanting to prove her resilience and needing a moment to breathe. Finally, she nodded. "Thanks, Mom." Isabella pulled her into a brief hug, her strength radiating in the small gesture. "You've got nothing to prove, Jenny. Remember that." Back at the table, Margaret's friends finally broke the awkward silence, though their words felt more like a lifeline for themselves than for her. "Well," one of them said with a nervous laugh, "that was unexpected." Another chimed in, her voice hesitant. "I mean, it's not like you could have known who she was. Right, Margaret?" Margaret forced a tight smile, though her mind was far from the conversation. The apology she had given Jenny replayed in her head, each word hollow and rehearsed. She had said it because she felt cornered, not because she believed she had done anything wrong. But now, sitting in the wake of Isabella's scolding, Margaret couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she had crossed a line she didn't fully understand. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. An email from her assistant, reminding her of a meeting with Isabella the following morning. Margaret's stomach twisted. What would that meeting look like now? Would Isabella even be willing to move forward with the partnership after tonight's disaster? Margaret's friends continued their uneasy chatter, but she couldn't focus. Her world felt smaller now, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. For the first time in years, Margaret felt uncertain, vulnerable. The confidence that had always carried her through was now a fragile facade, threatening to crack under the pressure. The ride home. Margaret left the restaurant earlier than planned, mumbling an excuse about an early morning meeting. Her friends nodded, relieved to have a reason to cut the tension and leave as well. The valet brought her sleek black car to the front, and Margaret slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The city lights blurred as she drove, her thoughts spiraling. She replayed every moment of the evening, trying to find a way to justify her actions, to convince herself that she wasn't the villain in the story. But no matter how she spun it, the truth was undeniable. She had humiliated Jenny. She had mocked her. And she had done it all without a second thought, because in her mind, Jenny had been beneath her. Margaret's chest tightened as the realization hit her. It wasn't just about Jenny. This wasn't an isolated incident. How many people had she dismissed, belittled, or intimidated over the years? How many times had she used her wealth and power to silence others, to assert her dominance? The questions clawed at her, each one cutting deeper than the last. Reflection. When Margaret arrived home, the emptiness of her penthouse felt heavier than usual. She kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of wine, her hands trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. The luxurious apartment, once a symbol of her success, now felt cold and hollow. Margaret sank into her plush leather sofa, her eyes drifting to the framed photo on the mantel. It was an old picture of her younger self, standing in front of her first office with a grin of triumph. She had been so proud that day, so certain that she was building something meaningful. But now, she wondered if she had lost sight of what truly mattered. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from one of her friends. "Rough night, huh? Don't worry, Isabella will get over it. You're too valuable for her to hold a grudge." Margaret stared at the message, a bitter taste in her mouth. For the first time, she questioned whether being too valuable was enough. Isabella's words rang in her ears. "Respect isn't something you reserve for those you deem worthy." Margaret set her phone down and leaned back, her mind still racing. Tomorrow's meeting loomed like a storm on the horizon, but tonight she was left alone with her thoughts. For the first time in her life, Margaret Whitmore wasn't sure if she liked the person she saw in the mirror, and that uncertainty was terrifying. The morning of consequences. The next morning arrived with an oppressive heaviness that Margaret Whitmore could not shake. The bright sunlight streaming through her penthouse windows felt like an accusation rather than a blessing, illuminating the cracks in her carefully constructed image. Margaret had spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by the echoes of Isabella Caldwell's words and Jenny's steady, unwavering gaze. She sat at her dining table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched before her. The city sprawled out below her windows, a landscape she had once felt she owned. Today, it felt distant, uninviting. Her assistant had emailed her the details of her meeting with Isabella, one she had been eagerly anticipating until the events of the previous night. Now, the prospect of sitting across from the woman she had so thoroughly alienated filled her with dread. Margaret stared at her reflection in the mirror as she dressed, meticulously applying makeup to hide the fatigue etched into her face. Her signature look, sharp, sophisticated, and intimidating, felt like armor against a world she suddenly realized she didn't fully control. For the first time in years, Margaret felt unsure of herself. Arriving at the office, Margaret's driver dropped her off at Whitmore Enterprises, the sleek glass tower a monument to her ambition. The building was as much a reflection of her identity as the luxury cars, designer clothes, and exclusive memberships she had accumulated over the years. Yet, as she walked through the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor, Margaret felt an uncharacteristic sense of vulnerability. Her assistant, Claire, greeted her with the usual clipboard and itinerary. Claire was young, eager, and sharp, someone Margaret had personally mentored. But today, Margaret couldn't help but notice how Claire's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than usual, as if sensing her unease. "The meeting with Miss Caldwell is scheduled for 10 o'clock in Conference Room 3, Claire said briskly. "I've prepared the presentation materials, and legal has reviewed the contract." Margaret nodded curtly, not trusting herself to speak. She made her way to her office, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The silence was deafening. Her perfectly arranged desk, the awards lining the shelves, and the view of the bustling city, all of it felt meaningless in the face of the uncertainty looming over her. The meeting begins. At precisely 10 o'clock, Margaret entered the conference room, her heart pounding in her chest. Isabella Caldwell was already there, seated at the long glass table with an air of unshakable composure. She wore a tailored navy suit that exuded authority, her expression unreadable. Jenny sat beside her, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, her demeanor calm but guarded. Margaret's stomach clenched at the sight of Jenny. She had hoped that Isabella would come alone, but the presence of Jenny felt like a deliberate statement. Margaret took her seat across from them, forcing a smile that felt as brittle as glass. "Good morning, Isabella," Margaret began, her voice steady but lacking its usual edge. "Thank you for meeting with me." Isabella nodded, her gaze piercing. "Good morning, Margaret. I trust you've had some time to reflect since last night." Margaret faltered, caught off guard by Isabella's directness. She glanced briefly at Jenny, who met her gaze with quiet strength, then back at Isabella. "I have," Margaret said carefully. "And I want to start by apologizing again for everything. My behavior was unacceptable, and I deeply regret the way I acted." Isabella leaned back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I appreciate your apology, Margaret. But an apology, while important, doesn't erase what happened." Margaret swallowed hard, her palms beginning to sweat. "I understand that. I want to make things right." Isabella raised an eyebrow, her expression unflinching. "And what does making things right mean to you?" Margaret hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had spent years navigating high-stakes negotiations, but this was different. There was no contract, no deal to close, only a broken relationship that she wasn't sure how to mend. I'm not sure," Margaret admitted finally, her voice quieter than usual. "But I'm willing to listen." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension palpable. Then Jenny spoke, her voice steady but firm. "Do you even know why what you did was wrong?" Margaret turned to Jenny, startled. The question wasn't laced with anger or accusation, but it hit her harder than any insult could. Margaret began, struggling to find the right words. "I treated you as though you were less than me because of your position. I assumed things about you without knowing who you really are." Jenny nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "It's not just about me, though. It's about how you see people in general. Do you think I'd be any less deserving of respect if I wasn't Isabella's daughter?" The question hung in the air, and Margaret felt a pang of shame. She had built her entire life on the premise of earning respect through power, wealth, and status. But in doing so, she had dismissed those who didn't fit her definition of success. "No," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're right. Everyone deserves respect, no matter their title or role. And I failed to show you that." A new perspective. Isabella watched Margaret closely, her sharp eyes softening just slightly. "Margaret," she said, her tone measured, "it takes courage to admit when you're wrong. But admitting it is just the first step. The real question is, what will you do differently moving forward?" Margaret straightened in her chair, the weight of Isabella's question sinking in. "I need to reevaluate how I treat people, not just in my personal life, but in my company as well. I've always believed in demanding excellence, but I think I've lost sight of what that truly means. Excellence isn't just about results. It's about the way we treat each other while achieving them." Isabella nodded approvingly, though her expression remained serious. "That's a start. But words without action are meaningless." Margaret met Isabella's gaze, a spark of determination returning to her eyes. "Then let me prove it. I'll start with my own team, ensuring they know they're valued, regardless of their role. And I'll personally review our company's policies to make sure they reflect that commitment." Jenny studied Margaret for a moment, then gave a small nod. "It's not about being perfect, Margaret. It's about being better." The words struck Margaret deeply, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for salvaging her relationship with Isabella, but for becoming the person she had always aspired to be. The meeting ends. As the meeting concluded, Isabella extended her hand. Margaret hesitated, then took it, feeling a sense of cautious reconciliation in the gesture. "Thank you, Isabella," Margaret said sincerely. "And thank you, Jenny." Jenny nodded, her expression softer now. "Good luck, Margaret." As Margaret left the conference room, she felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, shame, and a newfound resolve. For years, she had believed that success was measured in deals closed and profits earned. But now, she realized that true success was about something much deeper: the impact she had on the people around her. Margaret stepped into the elevator, the city skyline coming into view as the doors close. She wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to learn. The road to redemption. As Margaret descended the sleek elevator of her company's skyscraper, her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls. The polished image, immaculate hair, flawless makeup, a tailored suit, felt like a mask she had worn for so long that she had almost forgotten what lay beneath it. The echo of Isabella's words reverberated in her mind. Words without action are meaningless. When the doors opened to the bustling lobby, Margaret squared her shoulders, instinctively pulling herself together. She walked past the polished floors and gleaming glass walls, but the confidence she usually carried felt like an illusion, barely held together by willpower. Employees nodded politely as she passed, their greetings hollow echoes in her ears. For the first time, Margaret wondered how they truly saw her. Did they respect her, or did they fear her? The unexpected meeting. Margaret's day was far from over. Isabella and Jenny's words lingered in her thoughts, but they had barely settled when Claire, her assistant, caught up with her as she exited the building. "Ms. Whitmore," Claire began hesitantly, holding a tablet. "There's been a request for a meeting this afternoon from the Staff Advisory Board. They said it's urgent." Margaret frowned, confused. The Staff Advisory Board rarely reached out directly to her. It was usually her HR department that liaised with them. Did they say why? Claire hesitated, not specifically, but there's been some unrest among employees recently. They mentioned something about workplace culture. Margaret's stomach dropped. Normally, she would have dismissed such concerns, delegating them to her HR team. But after last night, and the confrontation this morning, she knew she couldn't afford to ignore it. "Schedule the meeting," Margaret said curtly, though her heart raced. "I'll hear them out." Facing the mirror. The conference room wasn't as grand as the one Margaret had met Isabella in earlier, but it felt just as suffocating. 5 employees sat across from her at a long table, representing different departments within Whitmore Enterprises. Their expressions ranged from nervous to resolute. Margaret recognized some of them. Jane from marketing, a rising star. Rahul from IT, known for his innovative solutions. And Kevin from logistics, a steady presence in the company for years. "Thank you for meeting with us, Ms. Whitmore," Jane began, her voice steady but tinged with caution. "We wanted to bring some concerns to your attention." Margaret nodded, gesturing for her to continue. "I'm listening." Jane glanced at the others before speaking. "Over the past year, there's been a noticeable shift in morale among the staff. Many feel that their contributions go unnoticed, that they're seen as replaceable cogs in a machine. And frankly, there's a culture of fear when it comes to voicing these concerns." Margaret's chest tightened. The words hit closer to home than she wanted to admit. She had always prided herself on running a results-driven company, but had she created an environment where her employees felt disposable? Rahul chimed in, his tone polite but firm. "It's not just about recognition. There have been instances where staff have felt belittled or undermined, not directly by you, but by the tone that trickles down from leadership. We wanted to bring this to your attention because we believe it starts at the top." Margaret's instinct was to defend herself, to point to her company's successes and the benefits they offered. But something stopped her. Instead, she leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "I appreciate your honesty," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I won't deny that I've been focused on results, sometimes to the exclusion of everything else. But if the culture here is making people feel undervalued, that's on me. And I need to change that." The room fell silent, the employees exchanging surprised glances. They had expected resistance, perhaps even dismissal. Margaret's willingness to listen was unexpected. Kevin, the oldest member of the group, spoke next. "It's not just about the culture, Ms. Whitmore. It's about trust. People want to feel like they're part of something meaningful, not just a line item on a balance sheet. If you can show them that, I think you'll be surprised at how much they're willing to give back." Margaret nodded, his words striking a chord. She had spent so long chasing growth and profits that she had overlooked the foundation of her success, the people who made it all possible. The turning point. After the meeting, Margaret returned to her office, her mind buzzing with ideas. The conversation with the Staff Advisory Board had been sobering, but it also felt like an opportunity. She pulled out a notebook, one she hadn't used in years, and began jotting down thoughts, sketching out plans to rebuild her company's culture. She thought about Jenny and how her calm dignity had exposed Margaret's own shortcomings. She thought about Isabella's strength and the respect she commanded, not through intimidation but through authenticity. And she thought about her own journey, from the ambitious young woman in the photo on her mantle to the hardened executive she had become. Margaret knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, humility, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. A call for help. That evening, Margaret made a decision. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a warm, familiar voice answered. "Margaret, this is a surprise." "Hi, Sarah," Margaret said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Sarah had been her mentor during her early days in business, someone who had taught her the value of relationships and integrity. "I need your advice." There was a pause, then Sarah's voice turned serious. "Of course. What's going on?" Margaret took a deep breath and began to explain. She talked about the events of the past 2 days, the confrontation with Isabella and Jenny, and the feedback from her employees. She admitted to her own failings, something she rarely did. When she finished, Sarah was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Margaret, it takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. That's a good start. But if you want to make real changes, you need to lead by example. Show your employees, and yourself, that you're willing to do the work." Margaret nodded, her grip on the phone tightening. "I will. I don't know where to start, but I'm ready." "You've already started," Sarah said gently. "Now follow through." A new beginning. Margaret spent the rest of the evening drafting a letter to her employees. It wasn't a polished corporate statement. It was personal, raw, and honest. She acknowledged the concerns raised by the staff advisory board, admitted her own shortcomings, and outlined her commitment to creating a culture of respect and trust. The next morning, she sent the letter out company-wide. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. As Margaret sat in her office, waiting for the first responses to trickle in, she felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. She didn't know how her employees would react, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time, Margaret wasn't just leading a company. She was becoming a leader worth following. The ripple effect. Margaret Whitmore sat at her office desk, her gaze fixed on the blinking cursor of her inbox. Her company-wide email, a heartfelt and uncharacteristically vulnerable message, had been sent hours earlier. Yet, her inbox remained uncharacteristically quiet. No influx of replies, no immediate responses, and most troublingly, no acknowledgement from her senior leadership team. She sighed, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair, which now felt like a mockery of her carefully crafted image. The silence was deafening. She had spent years cultivating an environment where she controlled every narrative, every interaction. Now, for the first time, she felt as if her words carried no weight at all. The first response. A soft chime broke the silence, and Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She clicked on the email notification, her pulse quickening when she saw the sender. Jane from marketing, one of the employees who had spoken frankly in the advisory board meeting. The subject line read, "Thank you." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then opened the email. It was short, but every word carried a gravity that she hadn't anticipated. From Jane, Marketing Team. Subject: Thank you. Ms. Whitmore, I read your email this morning, and I want to thank you for addressing the concerns raised by the advisory board. It's not often that leaders are willing to admit when they've fallen short, let alone take steps to change. While I know actions speak louder than words, this is a good start. I'm cautiously optimistic and hope this marks a new chapter for Whitmore Enterprises. Sincerely, Jane. Margaret read the message twice, feeling a small but significant weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't an overwhelming show of support, but it wasn't rejection either. It was hope, tentative. Fragile, but real. A humbling walk. As the day progressed, Margaret decided to step out of her office. Normally, she avoided the day-to-day buzz of the open-floor offices, preferring the sanctuary of her executive suite. But today, she felt the need to connect, to observe, to listen. She wasn't sure what she would say, but she knew she couldn't stay hidden behind the glossy walls of her corner office any longer. She started with the marketing department, walking quietly past the rows of desks. Conversations hushed as she passed, and employees glanced up from their screens, their eyes widening in surprise. Margaret forced herself to meet their gazes, offering small nods of acknowledgement. For once, she wasn't projecting authority. She was trying to be present. She stopped at Jane's desk, where the young woman was typing furiously. Jane looked up, startled, when she noticed Margaret standing there. "Ms. Whitmore," Jane said, rising from her chair. "I wasn't expecting." "Please," Margaret interrupted gently, motioning for her to sit. "I just wanted to thank you for your email. Your honesty means a lot to me." Jane hesitated, then nodded. "I wasn't sure if it was too forward." "It wasn't," Margaret said firmly. "It was exactly what I needed to hear." Jane relaxed slightly, though she still seemed cautious. "I hope you understand, though, that the staff are waiting to see if things really change. Words are a start, but they won't be enough." Margaret nodded. "I understand. That's why I'm here, to start making those changes, even if it's uncomfortable." Jane studied her for a moment, then offered a small, encouraging smile. "Then you're already on the right track." Confronting the past. As Margaret continued her walk through the building, she found herself near the logistics department, where Kevin, another advisory board member, worked. Kevin was older than most of her employees, with salt and pepper hair and a calm, steady demeanor. He had been with Whitmore Enterprises since its earliest days, long before it became the powerhouse it was now. She hesitated outside his office, feeling a wave of anxiety she hadn't expected. Kevin had always been respectful but distant, never fully embracing Margaret's aggressive leadership style. She wondered now if that distance had been a quiet protest against the culture she had created. Taking a deep breath, she knocked lightly on his doorframe. Kevin looked up from a stack of reports, his brow furrowing slightly when he saw her. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, standing and extending a hand. "What brings you down here?" Margaret shook his hand, noticing the firmness of his grip. "I wanted to check in with you. After our meeting yesterday, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the concerns you raised." Kevin motioned for her to sit, then returned to his chair. "I'm glad to hear that," he said cautiously. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure if we'd see any follow-through." Margaret nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't blame you for feeling that way. I've spent years prioritizing results over people, and I realize now how much damage that's caused. I'm here to listen and hopefully start rebuilding trust." Kevin leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Listening is a good first step, but trust takes time. You have a lot of talented people working here, Ms. Whitmore. They just need to feel like they're more than tools to achieve quarterly goals." Margaret felt a pang of guilt but also determination. "I know I can't fix everything overnight, but I want to earn back the trust of this team, one step at a time." Kevin nodded slowly, a hint of approval in his expression. "Then you'll need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Real leadership isn't about controlling everything, it's about empowering others." The ripple spreads. By the end of the day, Margaret felt a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. The staff she had spoken to were wary but receptive, their guarded hope a reflection of just how much she had to prove. She knew the real work lay ahead, in the actions she took and the consistency she maintained. Before leaving the office, she drafted another email, this one inviting department heads to a series of roundtable discussions. She wanted to hear from them directly, to understand the challenges and frustrations that had festered under her leadership. It was a small step, but an important one. As she hit send, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had spent years chasing power and prestige, believing that success was measured in profits and accolades. Now she was beginning to see that true success was something deeper, a legacy built not on fear, but on respect and trust. A quiet victory. That night, as Margaret sat in her penthouse sipping a glass of wine, she received a text from Jenny. It was simple, but it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you for listening." Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions. She thought about Jenny's quiet strength, about Isabella's unwavering principles, and about the employees who had shown her grace despite everything. She knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, Margaret felt ready to face it, not as the Margaret Whitmore who ruled with an iron fist, but as a leader who was willing to learn, to grow, and to change. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The first test. The weeks following Margaret Whitmore's initial apology were some of the most challenging of her career. Each day brought new revelations about the culture she had created, stories from employees that were both eye-opening and humbling. Margaret quickly learned that change was not about a grand gesture or a single policy shift. It was about consistency, empathy, and showing up in ways that mattered. Her leadership team was the first hurdle. Some resisted her newfound perspective, seeing it as a weakness. Others quietly tested her resolve, unsure if this was a passing phase or a true transformation. Margaret remained steadfast, determined to show that her commitment was real. A leadership confrontation. One particular confrontation with Adam, her head of operations, highlighted just how difficult this journey would be. Adam had been with Whitmore Enterprises almost as long as Kevin and was known for his no-nonsense approach to running the business. While effective, his leadership style mirrored Margaret's former self. Demanding, unyielding, and sometimes harsh. Margaret had called a meeting with her senior leaders to discuss the results of an anonymous employee survey she had commissioned. The findings were damning. 78% of employees felt undervalued, and over half admitted to fearing retaliation if they spoke up about workplace issues. These numbers, Margaret began, holding up the report, are unacceptable. We're failing our people. Adam leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. With all due respect, Margaret, this company wasn't built on making people comfortable. We've grown because we push for excellence. Margaret took a deep breath, her jaw tightening. Excellence and respect are not mutually exclusive, Adam. We can demand high performance while also treating people like human beings. Is this about that fiasco at the restaurant? Adam asked, his tone dismissive. Because I don't see how one incident should dictate how we run an entire company. Margaret's gaze hardened. It's not just about that one incident. It's about a pattern, a culture I helped create, and it's clear that culture needs to change. Adam frowned, clearly unconvinced. People might say they want softer leadership, but at the end of the day, they respect results. Do they? Margaret countered, her voice rising slightly. Because the results we're getting now are high turnover, low morale, and an unengaged workforce. Tell me, Adam, how long do you think this company will survive if that continues? The room fell silent. Margaret's words hung heavy in the air, a challenge to the old ways that had governed their approach for so long. After a tense pause, Adam leaned forward. So, what's your plan? Margaret's resolve didn't waver. We start by listening. Every department head will hold town halls to hear directly from their teams. I'll personally meet with each department to address concerns and set new expectations. And we're revising our leadership training to focus on emotional intelligence, communication, and collaboration. And if people still don't perform? Adam asked, his tone skeptical. Then we hold them accountable, Margaret said firmly. But accountability doesn't have to come at the expense of dignity. Rebuilding relationships. Margaret's first test of her new approach came during a visit to the logistics team. Kevin had organized a small gathering in the break room, inviting team members to share their thoughts and concerns directly with Margaret. It was an informal setting, with coffee and pastries laid out on a folding table, but the tension in the room was palpable. Margaret began by thanking everyone for their time. "I know change can be uncomfortable," she said, her tone warm but serious. "And I know I've made mistakes. Mistakes that have affected many of you personally. I'm here to listen, and I want you to know that your voices matter." For a moment, no one spoke. Then a young woman named Tara raised her hand. "I've been with the company for 3 years," she began, her voice hesitant. "And it's felt like I'm invisible. I work overtime almost every week, but I've never been recognized or even thanked. Sometimes I wonder if anyone notices what I do at all." Margaret felt a pang of guilt, but also gratitude for Tara's courage. "Tara, I'm so sorry you felt that way," Margaret said sincerely. "Your work matters, and I'll make sure you, and everyone here, know that moving forward." Encouraged by Tara's vulnerability, others began to share their experiences. A warehouse supervisor talked about feeling excluded from decision-making processes. A truck driver mentioned how outdated systems made his job unnecessarily difficult. Margaret listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. By the end of the session, the atmosphere had shifted. While there was still caution, there was also a glimmer of trust, a sense that perhaps things could be different. The turning point. Weeks turned into months, and Margaret's efforts began to bear fruit. She introduced initiatives that prioritized employee well-being, such as flexible work schedules, wellness programs, and recognition platforms. Town halls became a regular occurrence, with Margaret attending many of them personally. Slowly, the culture began to shift. One day, Margaret received a surprise visitor in her office. Jenny. Dressed in business casual, with her hair pulled back and her posture confident, Jenny looked every bit the young professional her mother had raised her to be. "Jenny," Margaret said, standing to greet her, "this is a surprise. What brings you here?" Jenny smiled, her expression warm but tinged with curiosity. "I wanted to see for myself if you were serious about the changes you talked about." Margaret gestured for her to sit. "And what's your verdict?" Jenny tilted her head, considering. "It's promising. People are talking about how you've been showing up, not just in meetings but on the ground. It's different. Good different." Margaret felt a swell of relief and pride. "It means a lot, coming from you." Jenny nodded, then leaned forward slightly. "But the work isn't done. There's still a lot of healing that needs to happen." Margaret smiled, nodding. "I know, and I'm ready for it." A legacy rewritten. As the first anniversary of her company's cultural overhaul approached, Margaret hosted an all-staff meeting in the same conference room where she had once felt untouchable. The difference now was palpable. The room was filled with energy and optimism, a far cry from the tension that had once defined it. Margaret stood at the podium, her heart full as she looked out at her team. "A year ago," she began, "I had to face some hard truths about myself and this company. I had to admit that I had let my ambition blind me to what really matters, the people who make this company what it is." She paused, her voice steady and strong. "I'm proud of the progress we've made together, but this isn't the end of our journey. It's just the beginning. My promise to you is that I will continue to show up, to listen, and to grow alongside all of you." The room erupted into applause, a wave of support that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt not just respected, but truly connected to the people around her. As the applause died down, Margaret glanced toward the back of the room, where Isabella and Jenny stood, smiling. Isabella gave her a small nod of approval, and Jenny mouthed 2 words that carried more weight than Margaret could have imagined. "Well done." In that moment, Margaret realized she had not only saved her company, but also redefined her legacy. And she knew, without a doubt, that the best was yet to come.